and it's the oldest building in Abbeyfeale that's been lived in and walked out of. Okay, the oldest building in Abbeyfeale. There had been an inn prior to this building going up in the 1700s, and the house was a small house, maybe about from door to door, with a thatched roof. Okay, Abbeyfeale was seen to prosper a little bit, and the Leahy family who had it were paying rent to the Ellis family, and gradually in 1812 they built the house this size. So we've listened to Margaret and we've listened to Billy Brother talking about two sides of Abbeyfeale. Predominantly there was the extreme poor and the poverty, but now we're going to look at how some individuals within the town did exceptionally well for themselves, okay, through the inn and through everything else. One of the most significant factors in the business improving at this location is actually the building of this road here. I didn't know myself until 5 or 6 years ago that Abbeyfeale was actually a small satellite village compared to a much larger town that was very close by. That town, believe it or not, was Drumtrasna. Yeah. Much bigger than what Abbeyfeale was. And this road was the bypass of its day. It bypassed Drumtrasna. Drumtrasna, I won't say it fell away, but it reduced in size dramatically to what it is today. And what houses and huts were around the old abbey flourished into all the main streets out the Killarney Road and elsewhere. Okay, so it became a boom town. Records that had been handed down from the various generations from Mr. David Leahy in the 1800s show that the people who were coming into this location, drinking in the inn, staying overnight, and there was a place around the back where there would be fresh horses. The horses would be brought out, attached to the individual's carriage, and they could continue their journey. And the people that showed up on it had been several knights from this country and the UK, loads of lords, ladies, marquises from throughout the continent, earls, barons, mayors, senior army officers, senior church clergy, doctors from all over the country, along with Daniel O'Connell and Princess Cristina Belgiojoso from Italy, which I'll talk about in a minute. That's just a general look at that there. Okay, so Daniel O'Connell, right. I'm not going to go into great detail about Daniel himself. We all know, we all grew up with Daniel in our history books. We have a general idea of what he's about. He's the guy that was pro-Ireland, pro-Catholic, and he's the guy who was very much responsible about giving the rights to the Irish people as opposed to the pro-English way of doing things. One thing that you may not be aware of is that around 1815, before Daniel O'Connell went into politics. By the way, I didn't know this simply, that's what I should have learnt it at school, but I didn't pay much attention when I was at school. But he didn't really get into politics as such until he was in his 50s. He was a qualified barrister for many years prior to that. And as a barrister in 1815, he made a statement about Dublin Corporation, a very derogatory statement, that it wasn't looking after the people that it should be looking after. And there was a guy who was a member of that organisation, or part of Dublin Corporation, called John Bianconi. And John Bianconi was a well-known duellist. Now for those who are younger in the audience, the duellist is two people would have an argument, they'd be handed a pair of guns, they turn their back, walk so many paces, turn, fire. One would have to be shot dead. John Deatir, who had a lot of kills under his belt, called Daniel O'Connell out. They met, they were handed a pair of guns, and Daniel O'Connell, who was the underdog and wasn't expected to win the fight, survived, and your man was hit in the hip and the bullet ricocheted into his stomach and he died shortly after. Okay? An interesting story about Daniel O'Connell. Maybe my teachers were afraid to tell me all this when I was going to school, but that's just something I picked up myself. Daniel O'Connell, once he started going into politics, this was the new road out of Munster into Limerick and Dublin. This was the superhighway. All the main traffic, all the big wigs, up and down the country, they would have to come through here. And this is prior, before any telephones, before any text messaging or anything like that took place. No cars, no bikes, everything was done on horse and carriage. And when Daniel O'Connell was travelling from Kerry, he might change the horses somewhere in Kerry, but by the time they come to Abbeyfeale, they were totally exhausted. So what he'd do, the carriage would be parked, he'd go in and have his drink and Leahy's in, and somebody, David Leahy or one of the family, would go around the back and they'd bring out a fresh pair of horses, tackle him, and away he'd go off to Newcastle West. And he's recorded, and his family are recorded in the accounts that were done in the 1800s and still exist today several times, and I have it up there, between 1836 and 1842, several times in our family. But what adds credence to all of that is the letters that were preserved by the Leahy family and handed down through the generation. A lot of people know of one letter. I have seen about half a dozen written by himself, his daughters and his sons, all organising transport. They'd send the letter about a week in advance. They'll tell Mr. David Leahy what day he will arrive, and all bar one letter, I think, the records were out by a day. So they had it down to a T. Okay? Now, that's just a little bit of snippet there about Daniel O'Connell. The rest you'd have all learned to school if you were listening. Right? Now, I want you to move over here, and I'll write a very famous historian from Dublin, and he was giving a talk to the Historical Society in the American Abbeyfeale about some of the records that came out of this building. And he was going along through all the names until he came across Princess Cristina Belgiojoso. And smart and all as he was, number one, he couldn't pronounce her name, and number two, he fobbed her off as being probably a Kerry woman. Right? So myself and Margaret on the way home, we hatched a plan. And our plan was, we're going to go back in, we're going to check the records, and we'll find out who the princess is.
He did all the work though. He did all the work.
And I'll tell you folks, what we found out about this lady is amazing. Absolutely amazing. She was born into one of the wealthiest families in Italy, if not the continent of Europe, in 1808. And shortly afterwards, even as a child, there was something different about this girl, because this girl was a firebrand. She was going to do things, right? It didn't make any difference what people thought, but she was going to do her own thing. At 16 years of age, she decided she was going to go off and marry a prince that she was after meeting. The marriage fell apart within months, definitely within the first year. They didn't divorce, they did remain friends, which is important for later in the story. In 1824, she'd have only been, oh no, sorry, it's 1824. Okay, so by the time, so shortly after that, she began associating with revolutionaries in Italy and throughout the continent. Italy at the time was a little bit like Ireland. Ireland was ruled by the UK. Italy had been ruled by Austria at the time, or at least a large section of it. She didn't like the idea. So at a very young age, she decided, to hell with this, I'm going to use all the connections I have, and I'm going to try get people together, and we'll make a run for it, come up, we'll hatch a plot, and we'll try and free Italy. Unfortunately, the plot and themselves had been caught. She was exiled to France, moved to Paris. All the wealth that she had been earned or was due to come into, gone. She was penniless. Not alone was she penniless, but she had spies from most countries in Europe and the Middle East monitoring her movements 24 hours a day. Her husband, where the marriage broke up, took pity on her, sent her some money. She bought an apartment. Then she began to get involved with more revolutionary activism around the continent. They fed her some more money. Then she got a saloon, and when she was getting a saloon, that became the focal point of revolutionaries all over Europe. And this created havoc in Europe. And there had been a number of attempts to do away with her by governments far and wide. Now, okay, now let me see now where we're going here. The 1830s. Okay, by the time she had the saloon set up, by the time she had upset all the governments in Europe, she was still only 22 years of age. So she was very young. She really had made her mark at a very young age. that didn't stop her, because she was determined that she was going to somehow keep hatching a plan to free Italy from the Austrian government. Now, there is a bit of a lag between the 1830s then, and in 1838 she had a daughter, Maria. And when she had a daughter, she got very nervous for the safety of her daughter along with herself. And the princess and some of her family decided they would leave the continent temporarily, take a break in the UK, and while she was in the UK, she crossed her over, made her way into Ireland, and she did a tour of Ireland. We know this from other books that have been written about her, but this is the only place in the country that we know of where she's actually documented as signing in herself in her own handwriting.
My God.
Okay? And she would have arrived from the Kerry side with obviously the child was with her, and she might have 2 or 3 people maybe looking after her. We know that the 4 horses that she hired out, and I did have the names and I didn't write them down, that's very clever of me, but there was 4 horses and 2 drivers that she paid for to take her from here to Newcastle West. What's very interesting is, it would be interesting to know, going back in time, how Mr. David Leahy, when he has those books, she probably went in, rested for a while the horses were being prepared. And so, yeah, sorry, that was in 1839. But what he didn't know then, and probably what she wasn't sure herself, is that everything she had done before would be nothing to what would happen in the years to come. Because when she went back to Paris, she really and truly got the urge going. She created as much money as possible. There was money flowing in all over the place. And let me get this right.
She inherited 2 legacies anyway, say that.
Oh, I don't know. Yeah. Okay, I need to move on to a second. I've become absolutely. I couldn't figure out why the princess, with the background that she had, would arrive in Abbeyfeale. But it turns out there is another book that we came across that specifically states that as a child she had a nanny, and the nanny kept giving her books on Maria Edgeworth. And Maria Edgeworth was an Anglo-Irish author, and a lot of her books were about Ireland, the Irish way of life, Irish women, and this part of the country. So we're almost convinced it was that attracted her into this side of the country. She was back in France. She had, remember now, a few years earlier, she had been exiled from Italy and she was penniless. She now had enough wealth gathered. She was able to hire and train her own army.
My God.
And she decided, we're going to go and we'll have another try at freeing Italy. And she took the army in. Unfortunately, she was beaten again. Right? She was beaten again. And she had to be exiled back to France temporarily. And then there was a section around Rome that became free, and she was invited to come in and take part in that. And she was given the position of a director for the hospital director within that area at the time. However, it didn't last long, because now that she was exiled in France, the French troops went in and they invaded, and now she couldn't live in Italy or France. So then she was exiled with her daughter to the Middle East, and she wound up in places like Syria, the Lebanon, Palestine, and all of these countries, traveling for a number of years. But all is not lost, folks. All is not lost, because she finally came back to Italy, and she went into doing it the peaceful, the political way, giving advice to the people that were going to be involved in the government. And in 1861, Italy was unified again. And she saw it, and she died a couple of years later at the age of 63.
Very good. It's a lovely story.
Actually, she died in not far from where she was born in Milan. Okay, so she saw it all happen.
Can I ask Maurice now to tell you a very interesting follow-up to that story? 2 days after erecting these, tell the story yourself.
Okay, 2 days after we erected, now we were doing it over time, but the one on the Princess here and Daniel O'Connell, 2 days later, there was an Italian couple in their 70s driving from Dublin to Killarney. They stopped off in Abbeyfeale, they stopped over here in the corner, and they were walking around just to stretch the legs. And they couldn't believe what they were seeing, because they come from where Princess Belgiojoso originally came from in Milan, and they phoned the daughter, because the daughter was just after doing a thesis in university on it.
Oh, of course.
And then they met him on the streets. Amazing.
Amazing, lad.
Who then meet in here?